Hello, my name is Patrick Usher, and in this video I'm going to be discussing why the fact that POTS syndrome, the cause of it, is to be found in the brain, and in the limbic system in particular, does not imply in any way, shape or form that the cause is psychosomatic. So this is an immensely important point because if it's going to be one big stumbling block, one big hurdle to the idea that POTS syndrome is caused by limbic system impairment, it will be the mistaken assumption that this is somehow implying that the condition is psychosomatic, when this could not be further from the truth. Now, a psychosomatic illness, of course, is something which there are often connotations that it is something which is caused by essentially a lot of negative thinking, a sort of proneness to being overly affected by stress. It's caused by even deliberately inducing an illness. At its worst, you hear people saying things like, oh, well, such and such read about this condition on the internet and then they suddenly had it. Well, that's a kind of example of a extremely prejudiced understanding of psychosomatic illness. So those kind of things. And it's very understandable why anyone with POTS would not want to be tarnished with that brush. And certainly by suggesting that it's caused in the brain, this is not at all using that brush. No way, Jose. It might look like it, because what I'm suggesting in the book and in the lecture is that the best treatment for POTS syndrome is what looks like a mind-body program, namely the dynamic neural retraining system, and that might seem to imply that POTS syndrome is a mind-body problem, but the truth is a lot more complicated than that, and certainly not suggesting that it's psychosomatic. Similarly, there's a great and appropriate, very appropriate anxiety amongst patients and medics alike to point out that although it's well known that there's a lot of adrenaline floating around in POTS syndrome, that this is not caused by anxiety. It's not a psychological problem, and a lot of people go to great pains to say this, and they're right, it isn't. But that doesn't mean that a mind-body program wouldn't help, for reasons I'll go into. So the main sort of stumbling block, as I say, to this theory will be to think that it's suggesting POTS is psychosomatic. But what this forgets is that there is not just a mind-body connection as far as the limbic system is concerned. There is also, as I say in other videos, a body-mind connection. And that in particular, not only are we as humans deeply affected by the mind-body connection and psychological traumas, but we're actually also affected, and in fact often more affected, because this part of the brain is actually more powerful, by body-mind connection. So traumas that happen primarily to the body can deeply affect the mind, and in particular the limbic system. And these things will happen, and you will have absolutely no say whatsoever in their development and how they affect the brain, because they happen automatically, according to basic primitive psychological and non-psychological laws. So let's say you have a viral illness, very common, 50% of people who have POTS have an antecedent viral illness. You have a viral illness, this is deeply traumatic to the body, it's an assault on the organism, it's an assault on the body. The brain reads this as a traumatic event, it reads it as an attack on the body, and the brain, because this particular illness is so severe, rewires itself, the limbic system rewires itself to enter a traumatic state which is hardwired, constant and perpetual. And this is what causes POTS. Now, who in their right mind would suggest that that is psychosomatic? Because what on earth could you have done about it? Seriously, nothing. Nothing at all. You would have no control over how the limbic system responded to such an event. So in no way is it being suggested that that is something psychosomatic. In no way. There is nothing you could have done about it. Nothing. And the limbic system is It's not just a psychological part of the brain, it's also non-psychological. It's involved in so many things. The entire nervous system is connected to the limbic system. So it manages so many things, okay? Rest, so digestive functions, the endocrine, hormonal, thyroid stuff, all of that is being managed in some way or affected in some way by the limbic system. It's involved in so many things, okay? So in no way, shape or form could anyone reasonably suggest who is vaguely compos mentis that that is a psychosomatic problem. Now, in the case of the sizable minority of people with POTS who developed it after a psychological trauma or a combination of psychological and physical trauma, as was my case, in this case too, it's not psychosomatic because the same principle applies. The limbic system is an automatic and primitive part of the brain. Events happen and the limbic system responds in automatic ways. It's not something that is part of the rational, conscious part of you, okay? So if you suffer a traumatic event at a psychological level, the limbic system will similarly just get on with responding to it, following its own laws, and there's nothing you can do about that either. This is very true, for example, of the primary way that we all know about for the development or for the way that events can affect the limbic system, namely in the case of post-traumatic stress. So, you know, you're to use a frequent and common example of someone who's a soldier, you know, who develops PTSD, they have absolutely no choice in the matter, none whatsoever. They are surrounded by constant carnage, you know, corpses which are being blasted, you know, that have been blasted apart. Bodies of dead civilians, of their friends, of all different things, the fact that they might have killed someone, all these things which will contribute to a case of post-traumatic stress. And the limbic system is so primitive that when it has all the flashbacks and high anxiety and hypervigilance as a result of those events, it's not the fault of the person concerned, because there's nothing they can do about how the brain develops in that way. Now, there may be something to do about it later in terms of treatment, but in terms of how the brain gets there, it does that of its own accord. Okay, very important to grasp that point. So, no one who ever develops POTS syndrome, whether it is through, as it most frequently is, the body-mind connection and a trauma happening to the body, which is perceived as traumatic by the mind, or through the mind-body connection, in either case, it is not the fault of the person concerned. In both cases, it is not psychosomatic. There's nothing that could have been done about it. Absolutely nada. Niet. That's the Russian for no, not nothing. I don't know what the Russian for nothing is. But anyway, niet. Okay, there's nothing that could have been done about it. So, two things to say still, or one thing that may be two sentences, or never mind, listen, I'll get on with it. So, compassion is needed, okay, for people with limbic system impairment. They're not crazy. They are not crazy. Their brains may be more sensitive than other people's. That's possible. It's quite likely, actually, that that's the case. But, whatever the reason, compassion is needed, and understanding is needed. It is neurologically and biologically possible for the brain to enter the kind of crisis I'm talking about. It's just not culturally appreciated, because people always think of the limbic system in purely psychological terms. Actually, it's hugely involved in everything, and it needs to be understood that traumas to the body can affect the mind. Now, having said all that, this is a very important point in terms of treatment of the condition, which is, yes, most of the cases of POTS syndrome are cases of body-to-mind traumas, but how's that going to be treated? Well, through no other way than a mind-body program, because it's all affecting the same part of the brain. It just, the initial trauma may come from the outside or may come from the inside. But whatever that the case was with that, it can still be treated with a mind-body program, okay? Because that will change the signal in the limbic system going down to the nervous system. It's a top-down intervention. Now, to say this does not imply somehow that the cause of the condition was psychological or psychosomatic. Rather, it's slightly more complicated than that. The brain enters a state of trauma through no fault of the person's own, through events that were absolutely horrific for whatever reason. But once the brain has got there, it needs to be helped out of the traumatic state. It needs to be given information, in a sense, that everything is safe now. Okay? And for that, you need a specific and very focused mind-body program aimed at rehabilitating the limbic system in a language that the limbic system will understand. Okay? That's what the dynamic neural retraining system does. That's why it's so clever. But to be hostile towards that program by thinking, oh, well, it's a mind-body program, I'm not suggesting that POTS syndrome is caused by thinking. It's not. It's not. No one ever says that. It's never said anywhere. POTS syndrome is caused by traumas. You could do nothing about it. But the limbic system, once it is in a state of trauma, can be helped out of that state of trauma by certain kinds of thought exercises and visualizations. In a sense, you can fool the limbic system out of the state of trauma and get it back to normal. That's why the DNRS is so clever. That's why I would say go for it if you're at all on the fence. I'm forever grateful to it myself. But it's a huge mistake to think that that's what the DNRS is suggesting. It's a bit more complicated than that. And one should never, in a sort of closed-minded way, develop a blinkered hostility towards it, because it is the cure to the limbic system problem, no matter how the limbic system ended up in the sorry state of affairs that it needs to end up in for POTS syndrome to develop. So that's all I wish to say about that topic. Thank you very much.